So we're on to topic 3.1, empires expand, and this is again in the new period of 1450 to 1750. And we're exclusively talking about land empires. We also have maritime empires, which will be covered more in Unit 4. But land empires, where they are, who they are, and how they expand is the primary focus of what we're going to talk about in this topic. So starting with our essential question, identify and explain two reasons for the expansion of the land empires of the early modern period. So we're originating, talking about gunpowder as being a major influence on the expansion itself. Hint, there's one reason, but explain a little beyond as you guys learn through this, through the lecture itself. So the gunpowder itself is a Chinese invention, originally trying to find some sort of cure for everlasting life and so forth. Ironically, it does not get used to that in history. And so, even though on the battlefield, the gunpowder had very little effect, it does get transformed over time to be a very, very effective weapon on the battlefield. And it forever changes warfare. It changes the world, really. There's a reason why we don't have walled cities anymore, because gunpowders would just blow them to Kapowie, right? So this is something that is going to play a role in the expansion of the empires, and we'll talk about each one of them a little bit, how that does play a role. We talked about how the Mongols had conquered much of what is Central Asia, and despite the fact that they had ruled and managed to rule over the empire fairly well, over time the rule is going to chip away and become more decentralized, leaving it vulnerable for new empires to rise up and challenge them and overtake them. And this is some of the empires that we are going to talk about today come out of the Mongol-controlled territory, or at least related to the Mongols themselves in some way. So, empires, they expand, and here's, of course, College Board language because it's in red. Imperial expansion relied on the increased use of gunpowder, cannons, and armed trade, and established large empires in both hemispheres. So land empires included the Manchu of Central and East Asia, the Mughals of South and Central Asia, and the Ottomans of Southern Europe and Middle East and North Africa, and then the Safavids of the Middle East. So we got a lot of empires to talk about, but we're going to talk about one to start with that isn't listed on there, but I feel is really important because it is a gunpowder empire, and it plays a massive role in world history itself. So we're going to start with Russia, the Russian Empire, okay? So Russia, we've talked about real briefly previously when we talked about the Mongols. And, the roots of Russia it's a Slavic-speaking people. If you want to trace the roots back to Russia, it also includes the Vikings who sailed down the Volga River to kind of establish trade and so forth. And, over time, what becomes these Slavic-speaking people end up creating these city-states that were, established for trade. And they would compete with each other oftentimes until the Mongols arrive. And the capital of kind of the Russians, the Kievan Rus is what they called them, was in Kiev, which is in modern-day Ukraine. And if you recall, the Mongols arrive and the Kievan Rus decide we're not going to cooperate. And we know what happens to people who don't cooperate with the Mongols oftentimes in history. And Kiev is destroyed, and Moscow, is left to kind of fend, or they're left to stand, but they, instead of resisting the Mongols, they kind of make themselves being, allies to the Mongols and say, hey, we will take care of the tribute stuff for you, we'll collect it and so forth. And then they skim off the top, and then eventually they are going to fight against the Mongols and push the Mongol influence out. Some of the stuff we'll talk a little bit more here later. But, Russia is really heavily influenced through the trade that they have with the Byzantine Empire. Through that, they travel down the Volga River to the Black Sea. Then they, arrive at Constantinople, which was an incredibly well-structured and, city that has tons of beautiful architecture, and they're just in awe. I mean, Constantinople was like one of the most well-respected places and cities, and just kind of roots back to history in a long way. We didn't get to talk about a lot in our world history curriculum because where we started. But Constantinople is a very powerful city. And so because of that, they're really influenced, and the Byzantine Empire itself and Constantinople practiced Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And that really heavily influences the Russians, and they adopt Eastern Orthodox Christianity. On top of that, the term for the leaders is czars, which kind of translates from what the Byzantines called their emperors, which were the Caesars. So Caesar, Tsar, that is another example of the influence that the Byzantine Empire had on the making of Russia. So we're going to start our timeline here with Ivan IV, he's better known in history as Ivan the Terrible. And why was he terrible? Because he did terrible things. So there. But please don't put that answer down on a paper. That's clearly not just the reason. But later in his life, he did kill people, including his sons, who he thought would challenge his rule and so forth. And so history doesn't bode well on or look kindly on Ivan IV, and that's why he gets that moniker, Ivan the Terrible. So he does expand Russia, and he takes control of Kazan, Astrakhan, and I'm not sure if I'm saying these right, and Serbia, parts of Serbia, not all of it, which were formerly held by what was the former Golden Horde of the Mongol Khanates. And the big reason why this is possible is, number one, they are using gunpowder weapons as a means to, arm their armies. And that is something that gives them an advantage. And so he expands his influence over this area. And I'm going to go to the next slide. I'll come back. But you can see this is the acquisition by 1505. This purple, which is, that's before. So 1584. So 1584 is the green acquisition by 1584. This green area and this stuff here is all kind of part of Ivan the Terrible's conquest. And you can see where they start in 1462, something in Moscow right here, and they just kind of had this area around the Volga River and so forth. But this is, the area that they expanded to. And so it doesn't seem very large because here's all this. Enter Peter the Great. Now, after the death of Ivan the Terrible, there is a short period known as the troubled times, and there's no ruler. Eventually, what ends up happening is the Mikhail Romanov is established as the Emperor of Rome, and the Romanov dynasty that's the beginning of it. And so that dynasty itself goes from 1613 all the way to the end of the Russian Empire and the rule of the Tsars in 1917, when the Bolshevik Revolution gets rid of the Tsars in favor of the communist government. Okay. So one of the most famous of the Romanovs was Peter the Great. Peter the Great does a lot of things. He was raised and spent a lot of his youth in Western Europe, and particularly in the Netherlands. And so the influence of the Dutch and the admiration for the maritime empire they had built led him to want to modernize Russia and play catch up with the Western states. And so, one part of there's a lot of things that go along with that, but as far as it relates to this topic matter and this theme, he is going to expand the territories of Russia even more so, create the largest land army in history at that point. And he would also, rely heavily on fur traders, on, militias, and then also military campaigns that would defeat the indigenous tribes that lived in the eastern parts of Russia as he expands further and further all the way to the Pacific. And you can see kind of here's the territory that was part of the expansion of Peter the Great. So by 1682. And so actually that's more like, we'll go back. A lot of the expansion is prior to him and so forth, but he continues to expand it and be able to take more control of that territory. But a lot of this expansion was done by militias and fur traders who were trying to expand their operations as well. So let me go back. the thing that he does also like promote is the more Orthodox Christianity, because it's used in a way that helps legitimize the rule of the czars and stuff, and create this cultural identity that they're all sharing within Russia, even though it's ethnically pretty diverse, considering all the land that they're covering. That one thing that they over time are able to accomplish is that the majority of the country would be Orthodox Christian. And so, the land expansions continue. They continue into Alaska, across the Pacific, and all the way into California. Russia has land claims and fur trade expeditions that are sent out there. So yeah, Russia, big, still is. All right. Kind of just to pick up with Russia a little bit more, St. Basil, however you want to say it, this cathedral is one of the most famous architectural wonders of the Russian Empire, which is still around today in the Red Square of Moscow today. The design and the architecture itself, while it seems unique, is really a combination of different architectural styles. And so the official name of this is Cathedral of the Protection of the Most Holy Theotokos of the Moat. In other words, it's a Church of Mary, the Mother of Jesus. Okay, so you see that Eastern Orthodox influence right there. Greek Orthodox. I mean, that this is clearly a Greek term itself. But it was built by Ivan the Terrible, and it was to commemorate his conquest of the Kazan Khanate. And the scholars that study this stuff and know much more about it than I do theorize that the onion domes right here are actually influenced by the mosque that was in the capital of the Kazan Khanates. And so it kind of makes sense when you think of it, if you want to mark your victory over people, you take their architecture and kind of turn it into a memorial to your victory. And so that's what they have here. All these bright and beautiful colors were not originally there. They were added later on in the 17th and 18th century. But that is, still a very beautiful cathedral that is found in Russia today. All right. We're going to switch gears to East Asia and talk about something that's more related to what the illustrative examples and what the curriculum is pushing for on AP World. It's going to give some background. So we talked about the Yuan dynasty. That's the Mongol dynasty, which was founded by Kublai Khan in 1271. Fast forward over time, they lose the mandate of heaven from the people living in China. Despite the fact that the Chinese prospered under the Yuan dynasty, they still were a foreign-controlled dynasty. So, in the Red Turban Rebellion, they are able to successfully overthrow the Yuan dynasty, and they replace it with the Ming dynasty. And the only time we talked about the Ming dynasty in this curriculum in AP history we talked about was that Jin Ha, who was the admiral who took the treasure ships and treasure fleet all around the Indian Ocean basin, he did it under the Ming dynasty's rule. But the Ming dynasty itself helped stabilize East Asia for roughly 300 years. And as soon as the Portuguese and other European countries are going to start to enter into the trade networks of the Indian Ocean and so forth, and start to trade with the Ming dynasty, over time, that there is going to be issues within the Ming dynasty, and the fact that more Christianity is being introduced in China, that gets pushed back by some people, and kind of this internal conflict that does happen leaves them vulnerable for invasion, which they do get invaded by the Manchus, who are from Manchuria, and they will end up seizing power away from the Ming dynasty and establishing what is known as the Qing dynasty. And the Qing dynasty, 1644 to 1911, is the last of the dynastic rules of China. And so, that is something that we'll be bringing up over the course of the next couple of periods of history. So the Manchus were this very powerful military state, and if you can see my mouse, this is where Manchuria is. That is the land of the Manchus, okay? So anyway, they end up conquering much of what becomes known as modern day China. Um, and one of the areas that I'm going to focus on as far as an example of the expansion, using those gunpowder weapons, they expand westward and go after the Zangar Kanye. It's also sometimes known as the Zangar State. But it's this area right in here. You can see Zangars. And so they are going to take their armies and military campaigns and do some diplomacy of signing treaties which surrender land and trying to use the great economic mobilization. Remember, China was like industrially more advanced at that time. They kind of were in that proto-industrial state. And so they were able to manufacture plenty of stuff that would allow them to be able to wage large military campaigns. And they do so against the Zangar state, which dominated what was kind of Western Mongolia, Xinjiang, which I don't know if I spelled that or pronounced that right, most likely not, and Tibet down in here. So these areas they are going to conquer and make part of the Chinese and the Qin dynasty lands. And so these conquests basically left a very strong legacy of the Chinese rule over this. This is why much of this land still today is under the control of the Chinese state, which continues into today. Okay. So then we're going to shift gears again to another area, and we're going to talk about the rise of the Islamic gunpowder empires. So this is including the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Mughal empires. All of them share traits beyond just the fact that they're Muslim states. They all descend from Turkish nomads, which dominated as far as the peoples of Central Asia, and then they expanded into what is now Middle East and North Africa. They are going to fill the power vacuum left by the breakup of the Mongol Khanates. The Mongol Khanates, when they kind of fall apart, a power void is there. They are going to fill that void. And much of that is dependent on their ability to successfully deploy gunpowder weapons into battlefields and so forth. So, and a lot of them are kind of tied to one particular conqueror, a guy named Tamerlane, or sometimes referred to as Timur the Lame. And I'm sure if you would like to know why he's called Timur the Lame, you can write in the comments or you can just email me, whatever. But Tamerlane is the guy who's going to come and conquer a big empire in the late 14th century. A lot of these three empires also kind of derive from those Mongol and Turco-Mongol belief systems and such, where they model the idea of the warrior lifestyle and nomadic living, and then also at the same time being holy fighters for Islam. And it also, because of Tamerlane's empire, he also serves as kind of a model of how the gunpowder empires are going to operate. So here's Tamerlane's empire, and you can see it expands a pretty good deal into kind of parts of India, mostly Persia, the Middle East, and even parts of what is now modern-day Turkey, or a territory we can refer to as Anatolia. So the first of and I'm going to get myself out of the way here. I'll just be right there. Okay. So the first of these gunpowder empires, the Islamic gunpowder empires I want to talk about, is one of my favorites. It's the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans had a great empire. And we'll talk more about the Ottomans, especially in the next unit as we get into the administration side, because they have some very unique and interesting ways of administering their empire that you will need to know for the exam in May. But let's start with 1453. Muhammad the Conqueror. Muhammad II is known as Muhammad the Conqueror. He is going to be the really important person, kind of establishes the Ottoman Empire as it would end up being. The big thing he does is he leads the Ottoman Turks to the doorsteps of Constantinople. And Constantinople, which was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, had slowly been losing territory for some time in the areas of the Middle East. And they've been losing it to the Ottomans. And so slowly the Ottomans are just surrounding Constantinople, but Constantinople was able to stand because of its powerful connections with maritime trade. And it had these gigantic walls, thick, gigantic walls that have protected them for centuries from invasion. The fact that, when they were put under siege, they had ways of being able to get ships into their harbors to unload supplies and so forth. It really was an impenetrable city for the longest time. And it was something that was kind of the challenge for the Ottomans to conquer. Enter Mehmed II. And there's a lot of things you can say go into this, and I'll put some videos that give some more details about this. But ultimately, what ends up happening is that the introduction of gunpowder weapons and the use of these cannons that were massive. I'll have to show at some point the cannons that were used to kind of destroy the walls and such, but they put them under siege and they just kept bombarding the walls of Constantinople, and it still took a very long time, to the point where the Ottoman Turks were able to enter the city and take control, and then they renamed it. They changed the name of Constantinople to Istanbul, which then kind of essentially translates the city of Islam. And they make it the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. The Hagia Sophia, which is the great cathedral that was built by Justinian I back in the 525. I'm probably off on those dates, but that was originally established as a Christian cathedral, which becomes a Eastern Orthodox cathedral, which then gets changed to become a mosque. Today it is a mosque still, but it is one that's open to the public for people to visit, and it's one of the world wonders of these eras. So the Ottoman Empire is going to continue to conquer, and using gunpowder weapons, by 1517, they're able to conquer the territories of what is now Syria, Arabia, Palestine, Egypt, and all under the Ottoman control. And so when we get into the Ottomans, we will definitely talk about them. They come up a lot in exams, and this is kind of the beginning of the Ottoman Empire as it is, right? So the Ottoman Empire does reach its peak between 520 and 566 during the reign of a guy named Suleiman the Magnificent. And Suleiman is going to help expand the territory even more so, and even trying to invade Europe, and it takes control of much of what is Eastern Europe. So Greece is going to be under the control of the Ottoman Empire for some time. And you can see a lot of the Turkish influences in the Greek culture today. And then they do try to invade into Western Europe, but once again, they are defeated, and it is at Vienna. And so the Vienna becomes a city that kind of stops the invasion of the Ottomans, and the Ottomans do not expand into Europe any further over time. But the Ottomans themselves do play a humongous role in kind of influence in Europe, especially the fact that when they take control of Constantinople, they end up playing a massive role in the trade and control of the trade, the Mediterranean, and that will in turn lead Europe to look for alternative routes, which in search kind of leads to Christopher Columbus going the westward way to find the East and finding the Americas. So my students really love seeing these pictures here. This is Mehmed II, and this is Suleiman the Magnificent. And there's generally always a question of what's up with the hats. And, there's probably a lot more to it, but I think that when you have a large hat like this, it definitely stands out like a crown. And so they're sometimes referred to as the onion head hat or the garlic head hats. But yeah, the bigger the hat, the bigger the man, right? So and that is how they are being shown in history, because if they obviously paid somebody to paint these, then as a way to kind of show their power and the prestige. And hey, Big Cat just wins, I guess, at the end of the day. This is the Hagia Sophia. This is it was once a Christian church. Like this area right here in the middle is it's the largest, one of the largest, certainly at that time, dome structures. And you can see all the parts of it down here. These areas were added on to kind of reflect what like your typical mosque looks like. But today it's a pretty impressive structure. They do have other structures that we'll talk about later that do get it added in because of the idea of monumental architecture as legitimizing people's rule. So let's move back to the Safavid Empire. And the Safavid Empire is where modern day Iraq, Iran, in the Middle East, Mesopotamian area is found. But the Safavids were another one of those empires that kind of break away from the Tamerlane empires. And the Safavids can trace their origins back all the way to when the Sufis would spread Islam into their areas. And so around 1400, though, the Safavids themselves adopt the branch of Islam known as Shiism, right? They end up using Shiite being Shia is Muslim, even though it's generally a minority in today's world. The Shia Muslims, they believe that that the true successor of Muhammad was his cousin Ali. I think I got that right. But this becomes a big kind of part of their whole government and administrative of the government, and why they will conflict with, especially the Ottoman Empire, who are Sunni Islam. But Shia Ismail is going to consider the beginning of this whole Safavid dynasty. And so in 1501, he begins to capture territories using, guess what? Gunpowder weapons. And so he captures Tabriz and continues to expand his empire and assumes like the title of the Shah of Azerbaijan, which is a territory that they're connected to. And he declares himself independent from the Ottoman Empire, which then leads to also why they have some conflicts over time. He also conquers some of the territories in the Caucasus, which are these mountains in here. Did I get that right? Yes, up in here, Caucasus. There you go. And another example of a military conqueror such of the Safavids was Abbas the Great. And he ends up kind of revitalizing the empire, and he starts incorporating slaves of the royal household into the army. He also continues to use gunpowder weapons. And he often would receive European assistance in helping fight, and especially because Europeans benefited from Ottomans being weakened. And so having wars, a series of wars with the Ottomans, over issues of religion and territory and so forth. But the Safavids themselves, they were able to continue to expand. They conquered the nomadic people of the Uzbeks. They were able to kick out the Portuguese out of the Persian Gulf, who were trying to gain a foothold and influence and control over the Indian Ocean trade network, which I was tied to. But anyway, this Safavid rule over this area still has influence today. Iran is a Shiite Muslim country, and Iraq itself today is roughly 51-52 Shiite to Sunni, even though only 10% of Muslims in the world today are Shiite Muslims. The vast majority of them are found in this region that was once controlled by the Safavid Empire. And then we next to the Mughal Empire, which is also a really fascinating empire itself. And I gotta get out of the way. I'm in the way always. Here we go. Let's just move me for there. Okay, so it's founded in 1526, and again, it kind of comes out of the Tamerlane empires themselves. but expands during the late 16th and 17th centuries and kind of starts to expand into the subcontinent of what we know as India. At its peak, you can see that included all of these territories right here, which is the vast majority of India. This area always never gets conquered, seems like, in Indian history. But the Mughal Empire is going to have several huge expansions, and one of the emperors that gets credit for a huge part of what becomes the Mughal Empire is the Emperor Akbar. And he is going to rule over this area. And even though he himself is Islamic, he understands that the people he's conquering are Hindu. And so he is going to be very smart in kind of incorporating more Hindu and Indian culture into his rule and his empire. And this allows him to continue to expand, because if he's not fighting against the people he's conquering, then it allows him to kind of conquer more territory. Despite the fact that Akbar did try to include more of Hindus into the empire itself and the rule and so forth, it never really fully takes place, and there are going to be resistance to the Mughals, and we'll talk about some examples down the road that are not linked into this, and I don't want this lecture to go much longer if I can avoid it. But they almost constantly face rebellions and revolts because of the conflict between the Mughals and the people who were living in the Indian subcontinent who practice Hinduism. So some of the things they are always constantly dealing with the kind of internal conflict. They also are trying to find ways to administer the rule over this territory. They do have some sort of military state system kind of set up, but it just never fully gains control. The Mughals are going to do some amazing things in their rule, and we'll talk about that. But by the early 18th century, we started to see fragmentations in the Mughal Empire that kind of opens up the door for the British, who are starting to arrive in 1850s, to essentially gain control over the subcontinent of India and wrestle control away from the rule of the Mughal Empire itself. So, moving on, I hope you're still with me at this point, but political and religious disputes led to the rivals and conflicts between states. So let's start with the Safavid-Mughal conflict and such. This is another example of conflict between states, and this is one that's provided by College Board. And the basics of this was a series of wars that were fighting over control of what is now modern-day Afghanistan. The Mughals are Sunni. The Safavids are Shiite. I don't know how much of a role it must have played some sort of role in this conflict, but from what I understand, it's mostly over control over trade routes, in particular the city of Kandahar, which is kind of major city and marketplace for trade. And so, once again, trade plays a huge role in influencing the world itself. And then there's also oh my goodness, how did I do that? The Songhai conflict with the Moroccan Empire, Moroccan people state, Morocco being up here in kind of northern Africa, and it's the gateway to Europe. It's right here we have the Iberian Peninsula, and so this kind of close proximity here certainly plays some role in Morocco's power. But the Songhai Empire, which we've talked about in previous, they are this large trading empire that's connected to the Trans-Saharan trade networks. They are going to have conflicts over control of those trade networks. Eventually, the Songhai Empire falls to the Moroccans because the Moroccans were carrying with them firearms, gunpowder weapons that they were getting from Europe in 1591. And so this is right around the time we started to see more European influence that starts to arrive, especially on the coast of West Africa, involvement in the slave trade. But that's something that will pick up more so later on. Okay. So anyway, that is it. I didn't do that, but go back into your essential questions. Think about two ways in which, for the reasons for the expansion of the land empires of the early modern period, and then go ahead and respond to in Canvas. Anyway, that's it from Mr. Henry and topic 3.1. I'll see you later.